Good morning and welcome to Infrastructure Victoria's latest webinar. I'm Jill Riseley, Acting CEO of Infrastructure Victoria, and today we're going to explore our latest research, Warning Signs, Climate Change Risks to Victoria's Infrastructure. This report, including the technical report, can be found on our website, along with all of IV's previous research. But first, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which we're all gathered. We pay our respects to Elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nations peoples. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Wurundjeri Nation, of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of country on where our office stands. For those of you who don't know Infrastructure Victoria, we're the state's independent advisor on infrastructure. We have three main functions. One is to produce the 30-year state infrastructure strategy, which we update every 3 to 5 years. The other is to provide advice when requested on things infrastructure. And the third is to conduct independent research such as this into areas where we feel there are gaps and things that are relevant to the state of Victoria. Just some housekeeping before we get stuck into things. You can submit questions. In fact, we encourage you to ask questions. You can submit these via Slido, which can be found under the live stream link on the website. Also there you can find the link to view this webinar in closed captions. Today I'm joined by my colleagues Llewellyn Renders, Director of Policy and Research, and Lorraine Conway, our Principal Advisor of Research and Policy, and they'll be here to answer your questions but also take you through the findings of this latest research. So Lorraine, without further ado, I might hand over to you to take us through some of the findings.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jill. And thank you everyone for joining us this morning. So our research is called Warning Signs, Victoria's Climate Risk to Infrastructure. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of background to this research and a little bit of the methodology before passing over to Llewellyn to talk about some of our findings from the research. To set this research into a bit of context, at Infrastructure Victoria, we do look at kind of what are the long-term challenges for Victoria's infrastructure. And one of those biggest challenges is climate change. So globally, greenhouse gas emissions are increasing, and that is causing our atmosphere to warm up. And what that means, it means disruptions to our weather and our climate systems. And so we experience more bushfires and floods, and we've experienced them more frequently and more intensely. And so while there are efforts underway to reduce emissions, we have also locked in an element of climate change already. So in 2024, we did some research, which was called Weathering the Storm. And in that, we looked at Victoria's infrastructure, and we found a lot of it is not actually being built ready for our future climate. And in that research, we looked around, well, what are some climate adaptation opportunities for infrastructure, and made some recommendations to government about incorporating climate change adaptation considerations in its processes and risk management and asset management frameworks. But we were often asked out of that research as well, where is the biggest priority for Victoria's infrastructure? And that's where this research has come from. And so with Warning Signs, what we wanted to do was to identify high-value infrastructure that is most at risk to climate change. And we did this by using a sector-wide risk assessment, where we actually looked at $318 billion worth of assets in Victoria, and we assessed the risk of those assets to 7 climate change hazards. So to give you a bit more detail about what were the assets that we looked at, this is it. So our scope included 10 infrastructure sectors, and we looked at existing state government-owned and some regulated infrastructure. Now, for 8 of these sectors, we drew upon data from the Victorian Managed Insurance Authority, and for 2 sectors, we supplemented it with additional public data. So, for instance, energy and major ports. And we included those sectors in there. So one is where government has some kind of regulatory lever in terms of like safety, but also kind of their importance as well. So we know with energy that it has interlinkages with each of our infrastructure sectors. And for major ports, we know about its economic contribution to its state and the importance to our supply chains as well. So here you can see the different infrastructure sectors, and they range from infrastructure that you can find in Victoria's parks, and that's at a value of $2.5 billion, up to energy, which is estimated value of $81.2 billion. But we also included in there things like health, which includes in there things like our public health hospitals and public aged care, as well as housing, which relates to our publicly owned housing infrastructure. So that gives you a sense of what were the assets in our scope for this study was. And when we're looking at climate change and we're looking at risk to infrastructure, we need to look at what kind of scenarios we're looking at in the future. And so we chose two scenarios and time periods. So a 2030 low emissions scenario and a 2070 high emissions scenario. And when I say about an emissions scenario, we've aligned that with the IPCC shared socioeconomic pathways as much as possible. And having these two scenarios actually kind of gives us a bound for our results. So we've got a lower end and a high end result for it. With selecting the time periods, we looked at 2030 because it is something that is relatively near term. And it also aligns with the Victorian Government's updates of the adaptation action plans, which Llewellyn will talk to a little bit more later on. And while we're looking at existing infrastructure, a lot of infrastructure has a long lifespan. So we chose 2070 as an appropriate out year there. So we've got our assets and we've got our scenarios. So here are our 7 climate change hazards that we looked at. So things like bushfire and flooding. And the way that we went about selecting these climate change hazards is that we looked at things that were relevant to Victoria. So on there, you don't see things like cyclones, for instance, but you do see something like damaging wind. And we also selected these based upon the impact that these climate change hazards can have on infrastructure in terms of either damaging the infrastructure or disrupting it. Now, for each of these climate change hazards, the data sources are outlined in our technical report. And for four of these climate change hazards, we do have projections for them as well. But it does mean that we've got 3, so flooding, rainfall-induced landslide, and damaging wind, where we don't have projections for them. And so what we've done there, we've actually used current day data, and we've represented that in the 2030 and the 2070 results. And what that ultimately means is that, in particular, our 2070 findings, that they are a conservative estimate. So that tells you a bit about like what's in scope for us. And this is our risk assessment methodology. So this is about how we combine things together to assess what is the risk to Victoria's infrastructure from climate change hazards. And so in particular, there were 3 components that we looked at. So hazard and exposure. So we looked at the different climate change hazards and we looked at where those hazards overlapped, where assets were located, so where they were exposed. But we also know from for a risk when we're assessing for infrastructure, and this is aligned with IPCC as well, that we also incorporate an element called vulnerability. And we did a sector level vulnerability assessment there. What vulnerability is, it's basically looking at, well, what's the susceptibility of the infrastructure to harm or damage from exposure to a hazard. And it can be different across different types of infrastructure and different types of climate hazards as well. And so the example that I think about with vulnerability is things like damaging winds. And a lot of our government services are delivered from buildings, for instance. And so with damaging winds and buildings are quite solid, sturdy structure. So they probably have a low vulnerability to damaging winds. But then we look at a different type of infrastructure. So something like energy infrastructure, so poles and wires, or the overheads on rail. And you can tell like that is a very different infrastructure that we're talking about. We're talking about lines that can kind of blow in the wind as well. And so we would say that those types of infrastructure have a higher vulnerability to damaging winds. And so you can have assets located and they can be exposed to the same hazards, but whether they're at risk or not depends on how vulnerable they are as well. So just to give you a little bit more about what exactly we did. And so we took the climate change hazards, so 7 of them, and we actually mapped them across Victoria. And then we overlaid where assets are located. So that gives us about what is the physical exposure of each asset against different hazards that we have. And this allows us to see where areas of Victoria are more exposed to climate hazards, But even the exposure analysis itself, so looking at those climate change hazards, they're actually really interesting to see kind of how they're quite different across parts of our state, and which shows kind of how diverse Victoria's geographic and climatic regions are. And so what I'll do, I'll just show you a couple of our exposure maps, just to give you a sense of what that looks like. So here, this one here is exposure to bushfire in 2030. And so our bushfire climate change hazard here, it's a combination of both bushfire weather as well as bushfire susceptibility. So basically things that burn. So we can see in the northwest of the area that we have high levels of exposure to bushfire. And then we can also see into the eastern part of our state as well that there's high levels of bushfire exposure as well. And that's largely where a lot of our national parks are, for instance. And we can also see that in terms of going down towards Wilson Promontory and the Otways as well. So what we did with mapping the exposure, we also looked at what does it look like in 2070. And we actually see that our climate change hazards intensify over this time period. So let's move to 2070. And here we start seeing a lot more in that northwest increases in exposure. But in particular, what I noticed particularly with this one here is when you're looking at central Victoria, so around that Bendigo area, that exposure has intensified in those areas by 2070. Now, let me just go to extreme weather, so extreme heat. So this one's a little bit easier to see. So we can see that northwest area, we know it's really hot. So it has our highest exposure to extreme heat. But when we move to 2070, we can see that extreme heat coming down much more southwards. And so it's covering over about a third of our state there as well. And lastly, I just want to show you our exposure to flood. Now, as I mentioned, we didn't have projections for flood. So what this particular map shows us is actually flood overlays. So these are incorporated in our planning schemes. And we also included a 10-metre buffer for it as well. And so we can see that our exposure to flood, it's following the patterns of, in terms of where historical flooding has been. So it's looking at kind of our rivers and our catchments and creeks, for instance. And it probably looks very familiar to people, like particularly when you're looking around Shepparton, Echuca, Swan Hill, as well as when we're looking around Western Port and kind of Lakes Entrance, Bairnsdale, Traralgon sort of area as well. So I've talked through a bit of background of the project and methodology and shared some of the exposure maps with you. What I'll do now, I'll pass over to Llewellyn and he will talk you through some of our findings from the research. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lorraine. And that was a great summary of kind of the methodology and approach we took to doing this piece of work. So I want to give you just a kind of quick summary of what we found after doing the process that Lorraine described. And one of the headline results is of the $318 billion worth of infrastructure in the analysis, over $57 billion is at risk to climate hazards in 2030. And that's in our low emission scenario, and that increases to more than $71 billion in 2070. That is in our high emission scenario, but as Lorraine noted, we don't have predictions for all of the hazards that we examined in this piece of work. If we look at how that $57 billion worth of assets is distributed amongst sectors, we see that roads make up about a third of that. And then the next three sectors being rail, energy and health in terms of the value of assets at risk to the climate hazards in this analysis. But we were able to do some further work and actually look at the geography of where those assets were across Victoria. So if we look in total at all of the infrastructure that was assessed in this work as being at risk to at least one climate hazard, we see quite a broad distribution across the state, but particularly across large parts of regional Victoria. We see some concentrations in and around Melbourne, as well as in and around some of our larger regional cities and centres. When we break that down to sectors, we begin to see some different patterns driven both by where the location of some of those assets are, but also where different hazards and the different type of hazards affect those particular assets. So if we look at road assets, again, our biggest category by value in terms of infrastructure at risk to the climate hazards we examined. We see a concentration in and around Melbourne, but also quite broadly across the state in terms of road assets. And, we do have quite dense road assets across Victoria as one of Australia's most heavily populated states per capita. If we move to something like rail, for example, we see quite a different pattern. We see actually a lot of the assets at risk concentrated in and around Melbourne, but also in the northern part of the state. And that's particularly because our assessment revealed that some of those northern rail assets are particularly at risk of exposure to high heat, as well as exposure to bushfire, where, as Lorraine showed you in the earlier pictures, they are very heavily concentrated in that northern part of the state. If we move to energy assets, again, we see some broad distribution, but some concentration in and around Melbourne, and also along the northern part of the state, particularly where a lot of our generation assets, as well as some of our transmission assets, are concentrated. But by contrast, if we look at our health assets tend to be concentrated in population centres. So we see the map of where health assets at risk tend to be concentrated in and around population centres, for example, Melbourne and Bendigo. But given when we look at those different hazards together, we can also see places where many different assets are at risk, potentially from even different hazards. So we can see a big cluster of different types of assets at risk in Melbourne, in and around Shepparton and central Victoria, as well as up in the northwest corner around Mildura. Whereas some other places, like in Gippsland, we tend to see a concentration of really roads being the major asset at risk. But a sectoral analysis and kind of which types of assets is not the only way we can cut the data. We also looked at, well, which types of hazards are the ones presenting the most amounts of risk. And we found that clearly bushfire and flood were the biggest two hazards that posed risks of damage or downtime to our infrastructure, followed by extreme heat. So if we look at how those hazards map out across the state, we see that broadly, and if we remember Lorraine's graphs and maps of where the bushfire risk was, we can see similarly quite a broad spread of bushfire risk across the state to different pieces of infrastructure in many different parts of Victoria. But if we look at a risk like flood, the other very large risk, we see that tend to be concentrated in the centre of the state. So in and around Melbourne, where there's a lot of assets, but also in and around Shepparton, where we know there is high prevalence of flood. And if we think back to Lorraine's flood maps, there was quite a lot of exposure to flood in many of those locations. And finally, if we look at a hazard like extreme heat, again, it tends to be infrastructure in the northern half of the state that is at risk from damage from extreme heat, and particularly up around Mildura. So that was a quick kind of tour of the results. There's obviously a lot more detail in the report if you want to dig into some of that. But I guess to sum up really, what does this research show us? It shows us that the risk to our infrastructure from climate hazards is immediate, and that those problems are going to grow over time unless we actually start taking sustained action to create more resilient infrastructure over time. The research identifies high-value infrastructure at risk of climate change, and particularly identifies which infrastructure types and hazards particular priorities in terms of the extent of damage they could potentially cause. That also helps government to prioritise infrastructure adaptation action, which we understand the government is currently in the process of doing. So under our climate change legislation, the government is required to prepare adaptation action plans, and those are due, I understand, towards the end of this year. The next 5-yearly adaptation, 5 years ago, the government developed the first round of those. And this report and the evidence we've been able to produce very much reinforces many of the recommendations that Infrastructure Victoria has made previously on adapting our infrastructure to climate change. As Lorraine mentioned, we've previously published work on adapting Victoria's infrastructure to climate change, and our previous report, released about 2 years ago, Weathering the Storm, made 7 recommendations to government about how it could do that. And we think this work really reinforces many of those. So, for example, we recommended that the government continue to coordinate and standardise climate projections. I think this project's really reinforced that issue for us in terms of the availability and consistency of the climate data that different agencies are using. We made recommendations about using asset management systems to improve resilience, and indeed this kind of work and data can feed into those systems to help asset managers prioritise improvements that improve the resilience of their infrastructure. And we also made a recommendation, number 7 on this list, to build confidence that good adaptation solutions will receive funding. And particularly with the opportunity presented by adaptation action plans being published in the near future, there's the opportunity for government to make sure that those activities are meaningfully funded so that progress can be made in this round of adaptation action plans. I also wanted to reinforce the recommendations we made in our 30-year infrastructure strategy, which we published towards the end of last year. And that similarly made a number of recommendations about improving resilience to climate change. Recommendation 28 of the strategy recommended that the government better prepare infrastructure for climate change, including by investing in infrastructure adaptation. Recommendation 29 recommended that the government use new flood maps to revise planning schemes. And we've already seen some pleasing movement in that direction, where new flood mapping is being undertaken by the Victorian Government, and new processes are being used to feed that into planning mechanisms to be more responsive. We also recommended that the government prepare and publish infrastructure sector plans. And again, those forward-looking plans about what infrastructure we might be building in the future and how we might respond to future change can very much incorporate ideas of climate resilience and infrastructure adaptation over time. And we also made a recommendation about improving asset management of government infrastructure, including better using the data we have and are collecting, including this kind of data to climate risks, to improve the prioritisation and use of asset management funds to ensure we're getting the best bang for our buck for our infrastructure. But that is a very rapid summary of the detail of our report. I do encourage you all to dig into the detail. There's also a technical report for those who really want to understand how we've gone about this. But otherwise, I believe we are going to do some questions. So I'm going to throw back to Jill to facilitate that session.
Thank you, Llewellyn, and thank you, Lorraine, for taking us through those findings and that research. We've had a number of questions already in Slido, and just a reminder for everyone, if you'd like to ask a question, we do encourage it. There's a link just below the live stream on the website where you can upload your questions. I was also quite excited this time you were able to pre-ask questions, which was wonderful. So we have a number of those questions as well. So we'll kick things off. Lorraine, first one's for you. Are the asset values based on current values, depreciated or replacement values? And I think that's obviously referring to the $318 billion of infrastructure.
Yes, and I thank you for that question. So the values that are in the report, so for our state-owned infrastructure, we've used the insured value, which has come from the Victorian Managed Insurance Authority. And then we've supplemented for those two sectors that I mentioned, so energy and major ports. We've actually estimated a value based upon public sources for that. So with those values themselves, that it is just the insured value or an estimated value that we've done. It doesn't necessarily reflect kind of what a full cost of an extreme weather event might be, though. So we're just focusing on the infrastructure part in particular around that.
Thanks, Lorraine. Llewellyn, a question for you. Have you weighted the importance of infrastructure based on just cost, or have you included how important some infrastructure is to the functioning of a community if it were impacted by climate hazards? So, for example, hospitals going offline in a regional area will be a bigger deal than other infrastructure.
Look, it's a fantastic question, and one we're really interested in. So the short answer is no. We have not done detailed criticality. We have merely kind of said, will the infrastructure, if exposed to the climate hazard, fail or be disrupted? And that, when you add all of that up, that adds up to, $57 billion worth of infrastructure by the methodology that Lorraine just talked about. Now, we can further prioritise some of that in terms of understanding the criticality of that infrastructure. And if you look in the back of the technical report, there's kind of some methodology about how you might go about that. But we did not do an asset by asset criticality analysis, which is, potentially a quite intensive task. But nonetheless, it would be a very valuable task to understand what is the consequence of that failure rather than just whether a piece of infrastructure would fail. So there is certainly, we would very much recommend that agencies trying to use this information can undertake further work to understand the criticality of those assets. And indeed, we understand that some government agencies are already doing some of that work. Thanks, Jill.
Thanks, Llewellyn. Lorraine, a bit of a two-pronged question here. As you don't have projections for some of those hazards, does this mean that the findings are inherently conservative and the increase in value at risk in 2070 isn't as high as I would have thought? Why is that?
Yes, so because we don't have projections for some of those things in there, in particular, flood is the one that I look at, because we do know floods are very costly to Victoria and they happen quite frequently as well. I'm thinking back to even the 2022 floods, in particular around like Rochester, for instance, and that flood event actually went for quite a long time. And we do know that going forward with climate change, that actually kind of those sorts of events may become more intense as well. So I do think with our 2070 results that we have there, that they are a conservative figure, just based upon that we don't have projections for all those hazards that we have put in place.
Thanks, Lorraine. Llewellyn, a question for you, and you've answered a little bit of it previously, but I'll let you expand on some of it. The results seem to identify the value of assets exposed to various hazards. But what do we know about the vulnerability of these assets? Could some be sufficiently resilient? And how do we know where to focus adaptation efforts?
Yeah, look, fantastic question. And so probably a piece of background is there are about 500,000 assets in this study. So we necessarily, to kind of have that breadth, needed to make some general assumptions about vulnerability of different asset sectors. So our vulnerability analysis that we've used to determine, well, is a piece of infrastructure vulnerable to the hazard was a sector level analysis. So generally, what do assets of that type, how vulnerable are they to the different hazards we looked at? Now, you could do a much deeper analysis of what is the vulnerability of individual assets on an asset by asset basis. Again, a much more intensive piece of work than we've been able to do in this piece of work, but nonetheless would reveal much more fine-grained information about which particular assets might be the most vulnerable, and therefore which ones you might prioritise in terms of investing in adaptation activities. To the earlier point, the next layer of that as well is, well, what are the consequences of that failure? And, you know, some assets may have much greater consequences if they fail than others. And so providing that lens on an individual asset basis as well would give you even better information about where you might prioritise your funding. Does that answer the question, Jill?
I think it does, absolutely. I've got a follow-up one, not off the hook yet, Llewellyn. Lorraine mentioned the floods before, and we know that Victoria's already experienced quite a lot of extreme weather and natural disasters. But the government is facing a tight budget and fiscal environment. Why would they invest, or should they invest, in adaptation? And I'll throw that one to you, Llewellyn.
Cool. So look, interestingly, and we kind of explored this question a little bit in the earlier work around in the Weathering the Storm report, because what we actually found in much of that work, that many of the most cost-effective adaptation actions were often very, very low-cost options. So things like just maintaining gutters properly, just doing regular maintenance on road surfaces, sometimes just upping the maintenance a little bit, actually had very large returns in the performance of those assets during a hazard event and their ability to recover quickly afterwards. So building resilience of infrastructure and investing in infrastructure adaptation need not be really expensive. Nonetheless, also very aware and would always, encourage governments to invest in what's important and not merely what's urgent. So I think there is always the opportunity for governments to reassess where it's investing. We've certainly seen a lot of investment in climate mitigation and emissions reduction, and we think there's opportunities to also accompany that investment with climate adaptation work, and particularly trying to prevent the cost of disasters rather than spending a lot of money after disasters trying to recover.
Thanks, Llewellyn. Lorraine, one for you, and we get this question a little bit since releasing the report. It's a question about local government infrastructure. Why haven't you looked at local government infrastructure in this research?
Yes, so we haven't looked at local government infrastructure in this. We have focused on the state infrastructure, state-owned infrastructure primarily. But that's not to say that that's not relevant for local governments, because that infrastructure is in their local government areas, so they do have an interest, and they do have kind of similar assets as well. So roads are delivered by both state government and local government as well. So with some of the methodology that we used, that is something that local governments can use themselves. But we also know that local governments, that they have been doing work in climate adaptation as well. So we know, for instance, the Eastern Alliance of Greenhouse Action, for instance, that they were doing cost-benefit studies of local roads, for instance, for climate adaptation. And a lot of local governments do have climate action plans as well. So it's still, I think it still has relevance to local government. It'll be of interest to them, as well as even just our exposure maps as well. So having a look around kind of what are the different climate hazards that particular areas are exposed to as well. So I think it'll be helpful in that way.
Thanks, Lorraine. Question for you, Llewellyn. In this research, we're looking at the physical infrastructure, so bricks and mortar and the physical assets. But what does this mean for service delivery? Have you looked at the cost impact of that?
So short answer, no, but again, a really interesting question. So this research really kind of took an infrastructure lens and kind of went, what is the likelihood that the infrastructure will fail or be unavailable for use for services if the climate hazard eventuated? It would be a further piece of work, but a valuable piece of work to then kind of go, well, what is the consequence for service delivery of that infrastructure failure? Or indeed, even if infrastructure is fine, can services still be delivered if this climate hazard occurs in this place? So as a piece of infrastructure work, we very much concentrated on what are the consequences for infrastructure and what is the likelihood that that infrastructure will fail. The broader question or another question of, well, what is the impact on services? How do those hazards affect the deliverability of services is a further piece of work. Again, a very valuable one, but not one that we covered in this.
Thanks, Llewellyn. So looking at that example, so for a hospital, for example, we've looked at the hospital infrastructure failing. We haven't looked at the impacts of extreme heat on presentations or service delivery. So another piece of work for government to consider in those adaptation plans, I assume. I've got quite a specific question here for you, Llewellyn, possibly from someone in an office like we are. But what are your thoughts on the impact of high-rise buildings and their resilience to climate effects such as extreme heat?
That is a technical question. So I don't want to go beyond my technical knowledge and speculate too much. I mean, interestingly, I guess something that we've done in earlier work, which is, not quite answering the question, but a related topic was, well, what is the impact of densification more broadly on environmental issues? And I guess in a report we released a couple of years ago called Choosing Victoria's Future, we actually compared some environmental variables with denser or more sprawling cities. And I guess the major finding of that piece of work is if we create denser cities, which, does mean kind of taller buildings, we actually use a lot less land, and it is much easier to avoid building in places of climate risk or indeed building on land that might have high biodiversity values. So by limiting the amount of urban expansion, we can reduce the impact of some of our metropolitan areas on the environment. Now, that probably doesn't quite answer the technical question about the resilience of tall buildings, but I am aware that question probably hinges on the standard to which those buildings were built.
Well, don't worry, I'm sure you'll get cornered in the office later for a more detailed analysis. We've got a question here around what would delayed action in adopting the recommended risk or resilience actions mean? How would it impact on communities and ecosystems? And Llewellyn, you've answered that question a little bit already around how this research is useful in understanding where the risk is, so that can be built into future decision making. But do you have any comments around, I guess, what the future impact for communities and ecosystems if we ignore the risks around extreme weather and what government should consider in terms of what those future impacts might be?
Yeah, look, it's a brilliant question, and I don't pretend to have a complete answer to it, but certainly what this research really demonstrates, again, is that the impacts of these extreme weather events are real and they are getting more frequent and they are getting more intense over time. And communities in Victoria already know what it means when one of these big extreme weather event hits. It can mean your power is out for days on end. It can mean literally your home burns down. It can mean that your home is flooded or your town is flooded, and it takes years for that community to recover. So communities really understand the impact of these extreme weather events already. But if we don't start adapting our infrastructure and communities more broadly to them, we're going to see those impacts get worse and more frequent over time. And I think this kind of work and these, we've called the report warning signs precisely because the warning lights are flashing, and if governments don't act, we're going to see the impacts and the costs of these type of events get worse and worse over time. And people and communities suffer as well as infrastructure, be destroyed or rendered dysfunctional.
Thanks, Llewellyn. Warning signs indeed. A question for you, Lorraine. One around the vulnerability and how did this account for existing adaptation measures? So I think probably a question trying to understand how we provided some of the advice around adaptation, possibly also linking back to weathering the storm and the vulnerability assessment of infrastructure.
Yes, so with the vulnerability assessment, so all the details are contained in ARUP's technical report. So it's in an appendix there where we've kind of outlined for each infrastructure sector. So we've done it at that sector level itself. Kind of what are some vulnerability statements against each climate change hazard? And so it's vulnerability of the infrastructure to damage and vulnerability of the infrastructure to disruption as well. And so we have done, it is a high level assessment there for it. So sorry, can you repeat the first part of the question, Jill? There was a particular angle that they were seeking some information on.
We have, and we've had a follow-up question which is even more specific. So I might actually jump to that one because it will answer the question around vulnerability and adaptation. So what assumptions does the modelling make in relation to existing mitigations like flood protection, seawalls, stormwater systems, and slope stabilisation? So when we were considering the risk and the vulnerability, how does that consider what's there already?
Gotcha. Thank you. So for it, we have done it at that high level. So if there were some information around kind of sector wide that there's something that is in place. So standards for instance, so kind of standards were incorporated in there. For instance, like knowing about kind of the wind speeds for wind turbines might shut off at certain levels of wind speeds, for instance. So some general things are incorporated in there, but we haven't gone down into the specific assets themselves. So it might be that specific assets have had some mitigation done to it, so some climate change adaptation to particular assets. So we haven't captured that, and we've tried to capture it at that kind of sector-wide level for it.
Thanks, Lorraine. Now, a question for Llewellyn. This research doesn't include privately owned critical infrastructure. So that's, I assume from, let's take a private hospital, for example, nor does it include individual households and private assets. What could this research say will be useful for non-government infrastructure?
Yes, fantastic question. It obviously, in terms of the energy sector, it does include some private infrastructure, but absolutely correct that it doesn't include a lot of private infrastructure or private homes. So there's two kind of parts to the answer. The first is actually understanding the consequences of infrastructure failure on other sectors is one use of this. So if you understand the consequences of failure of the energy system, if you understand the consequences of failure of a hospital in a local community, that will have flow-on impacts to other forms of infrastructure. The other application is, of course, the methodology, right? So we have done an analysis of public infrastructure largely, but the exact same process could be used to analyse other sectors and privately owned infrastructure or housing as well.
Thanks, Llewellyn. And we know our previous research with weathering the storm was actually one of the COPs, but also that methodology has been adapted and used a number of times. And as you correctly point out, this methodology is here along with that technical report for people to be able to adapt and use themselves. A question for you, Llewellyn. What does this research mean for future infrastructure planning? And is the Victorian Government taking your work into account?
So the kind of information about climate risks and the places which are more risky than others is, I think, a really useful planning tool for agencies, state, federal, local, to be using in their planning work about future infrastructure construction, or indeed future urban development, a whole bunch of other queries and questions. If you understand the places that are most likely to experience some of these hazards in the future, you can avoid building in them, or if you have no choice but to build in them, you can build to an appropriate standard to protect that asset should the hazard eventuate. We have had actually amazing feedback on both our previous Weathering the Storm report and this report as well, from both government and non-government agencies and individuals. So we are, always in dialogue with government. We're really interested in the different ways that they can be using some of this information. But we're also really aware that the kind of next big milestone in Victoria's adaptation journey will be the revision of those adaptation action plans. And we're really interested in seeing how government might use some of this information and the previous work in weathering the storm to take the next step on adapting Victoria, including its infrastructure, to the increasing climate risk we face.
Thanks, Llewellyn. Lorraine, we've had a couple of quite specific questions around the data sets that we've selected and why we didn't select certain very specific geographically based data sets. So I'll get you to provide a little bit of an overview of the data sets that we selected and sort of the need around looking at an assessment from a statewide perspective. But also there's a question here about the interdependencies and how we assess those. So what happens when a road fails and emergency services lose access? So if you could talk a little bit about how we've applied those data sets, that would be great.
Yeah, great. So the data sources, they are contained in the technical report itself. When we were looking for instance, the climate change hazard information, we tried using the best available that was at that time for it. So there is a whole, if you've been looking at climate change, you can find a whole range of data that is available that you kind of need to kind of trawl through for it. But when we were looking at it, we were looking at a statewide assessment itself. So we were looking at finding data sets that kind of applied at that level so that we could have some consistency across our assessment itself. So I do appreciate there are particular studies that have been done in particular areas that might go down into more details in a locality, and that information is really important. But for us to kind of be keeping this assessment on the same level, we did draw upon kind of those statewide data sets for it. And there was a second part of the question there as well, Jill.
Yeah, Lorraine, about the interdependency. So if a road fails, I think that the question probably inserts a little bit around service delivery, which we've explained isn't part of this research. But I think there's probably a really interesting question there around the flow-on effects of the interdependencies of the infrastructure.
Yeah, there certainly are, and definitely in a lot of our discussions as well, it is something that we talk about quite often. So in terms of kind of like those cascading impacts that can happen. So when talking about it, for instance, we talked before about a health service, for instance, and it can be impacted by a flood event, for instance. But it also, if the roads are affected as well, then how you get patients to be transported there, but also staff as well that may actually live in the area and be impacted by that, and they might not be able to have access to that building as well. So when looking at it, we can see actually our infrastructure sectors are quite interconnected in that way. And Llewellyn mentioned a bit about, we did a high-level criticality assessment. And one of the things that we did do in there, we did find kind of things that came out more were terms of roads, energy and health. But particularly the energy and roads is because of their interdependencies with other sectors themselves. So electricity is a big one. It's something where electricity goes out and kind of the implications for how our infrastructure operates in those scenarios as well.
Thanks, Lorraine. One of the interesting things in this research that I hadn't fully appreciated before was actually the compounding impacts of climate hazards as well. So I think you gave a good example of roads and the propensity for landslides after a bushfire. And so we sometimes see sort of the compounding impacts of not only climate risks, but hazards once one hazard has occurred, which just makes it even more exciting as we adapt into the future. We've got a few more questions. One, Llewellyn, I don't think you know the answer to, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because we often get asked. Flooding is showing up as a big climate hazard, and that we need to be ready for. When will improved and updated flood projections become available?
Fantastic question. And yes, I have to confess I don't have an exact answer, but I do know that the government did make some announcements last year about prioritising and giving particularly catchment management authorities, I believe, some greater role in actually doing future flood projections. And being able to incorporate that into planning schemes over time. So while, I'm not sure about the timelines of all of that work, I am aware that work is being undertaken and that over time we can expect there to be more up-to-date flood information and more detailed and geographically specific flood information being released over time as those flood modelling work is completed.
Thanks, Llewellyn. A couple of questions here. One, it might be great for you to sort of explain a little bit about how our 2024 report findings weave their way into the 2025 strategy. The question here is how many of the recommendations from the Weathering the Storm report has the government implemented in projects or policies?
Is that a question for me, Joel?
Yes, sorry, Llewellyn, I was throwing you in the deep end there as well.
Look, we've actually, particularly on a project by project basis, have actually had quite a few interactions with many projects that are aware of the work, are kind of using these ideas in different ways, and in fact trying to get better and improve their practice at kind of building resilience into the infrastructure as it's constructed. So we've been very pleased about some of the reception and some of the work that is continuing in government to, consider climate risk, to build in adaptation from this, to build in resilience from the start. That being said, we're all at the start of this journey together, and there's still a long way to go. But we think there is certainly goodwill across government and in infrastructure agencies to attend to this. But I think it's fair to say that progress is not as fast as we would love, but nonetheless, we do see evidence of the ideas being taken up and applied and practice improving over time.
Thank you. Now, Lorraine, one for you. Given the findings in this report, if you were the government, where would you start?
Yes, so I think in there we've articulated kind of the four sectors that have most value at risk and identified kind of where there's concentrations of value at risk for each of those sectors as well with those locations. I mean, you could look, so for instance, roads, there's over $20 billion at risk in 2030 to at least one climate change hazard. You could even start breaking that down a bit further from there. So in terms of its climate change hazard, so I think it has the most value at risk to bushfire and then followed by flood, for instance. So you can start articulating the risks more clearly. And with the maps as well, we start seeing where the areas of Victoria as well. So I think when Llewellyn was showing kind of around Melbourne area, and we can see extending up to north as well for it. So there's a few starting points that are there, and we've narrowed it down. I also find it really interesting the map that Llewellyn showed, which had just those four infrastructure sectors, and where we actually saw kind of places where there was multiple infrastructure types that had value at risk, and so that starts giving a bit of a call out to kind of place-based climate adaptation as well. So is there something that you can look at in those particular areas where you could do an adaptation measure that could have benefits for all of those sectors, for instance? So there's quite a few ways that you can start looking at it and start prioritising as well.
Thank you, Lorraine. Lots of food for thought there. It's probably a great place for us to end. Thank you everyone for watching and tuning in today. It's been an incredibly well received piece of research, and we're always pleased to talk about it and happy to answer queries. As Llewellyn mentioned, the full report is on our website, as is the technical report for people who want to go particularly deep into the science and the impacts. Please do, it's all there, as is our previous reports and research, as well as all the accompanying technical reports. So there's a lot of reading on the website should you like to dive in. You can also sign up for our newsletter to keep up to date on future webinars and our research reports, and you can find that link on the website as well. There'll also be a prompt at the end of this webinar and a brief survey, and if you could complete that, it is super short, but it really does help us inform how we can provide better webinars or tailor them to make sure that they're really hitting the mark. So if you could complete that, we'd be really grateful. But that's all from us for now. Thank you very much for tuning in and have a great rest of the day.